So now the Swedes from Gammalsvenskby were in Sweden, just standing at the port of Trelleborg, taking in the sea breeze and staring at the country that was both foreign and somehow home. But then came the obvious question. Now what? What do we do now? You see, this journey came at a huge cost. The cost of leaving everything that they owned, with them only being able to take the lightweight things they could carry. All the rest was left behind in the Soviet Union. So this meant they were basically starting over from nothing. And now the question was, what kind of life could they build here? What kind of work could they do? However, luckily for them, the Swedish government had already planned that out. They thought that maybe letting them hold on to something familiar when everything else was completely foreign could help them adjust to the new life quicker. Plus, it also meant that their farming expertise wouldn't go to waste, so it was a win-win situation. So the Swedish government carefully guided them into jobs on Swedish farms. And while farming in Sweden was a bit more industrialized than in the Soviet Union, it still hadn't reached far enough to make the transition that difficult for the Gammalsvenskby Swedes, so that turned out great. But still, the Swedes of Gammalsvenskby had another problem to face. And that problem was the language barrier. Wait, what? Language barrier? Didn't they all speak Swedish? Well, yes, they did. But not quite the same Swedish as everyone else. Let me explain. You see, while these Swedes had lived in Ukraine their entire life, they still originally, as you know, were from Dagö, which meant they still spoke the dialect local to that area, called Estonian Swedish. This dialect was somewhat of a relic from the past, but that wasn't really the issue here. No, the issue that made their Swedish so different from the others was that being separated for so long had made their Swedish evolve in different ways than standard Swedish. Much of this came about when people had to name new inventions. So if you take steamships for example, when they became a thing, standard Swedish started calling them ångbåt, being just a direct translation of the English word. However, the Swedes in Gammalsvenskby did not do the same thing. Since they were unable to communicate with the mainland, they instead took the Russian word for them, and started calling them parohod. So their version ended up including multiple other words for various things. But it doesn't even end there, because again, with them being disconnected from the language pipeline, it meant that they had unknowingly preserved a bunch of older words that had long been phased out from everyday Swedish. Meaning that when they now talked to their fellow Swedes, they sounded very, well, ancient. Which is why they quickly got labeled Ancient Swedes. As you can imagine, this difference in speech didn't help them get integrated into society. This in turn led to them only speaking with each other, and that got the Swedish government to start panicking. What if these so-called ancient Swedes would never assimilate, and only live in a closed-off bubble? The Swedish government could not let that happen, so they quickly drew up a plan that made sure they had to talk to the other Swedes, even if it felt awkward at first, and it looked like this. The Swedes from Gammalsvenskby would all be barred from settling in one area, and instead, they would be split up into smaller groups and sent to different cities. This resulted in some being sent to Stockholm, some to Jönköping, and many, actually the majority, being sent to this island, called Gotland. Gotland became pretty important for the ancient Swedes, since it shared so many similarities to their long-lost home, Dagö. Also, out of the people who arrived, around 100 decided to ditch Sweden completely and instead move to Canada. But anyways, back to Sweden. So how did it go then? Did the integration plan work? Well, for the majority, yes, it did work. However, for a big minority, it went the complete opposite. As it turned out, after only as little as 4 months, about 250 villagers decided that they had had enough, and that they were going to move back. Now this may seem completely ridiculous. However, the decision wasn't just because they had a hard time adjusting. They were also bombarded with Soviet propaganda, promising a better life, and even encouraged by the Swedish Communist Party. So before the year was over, they were back. But wouldn't you know it, life in the Soviet Union would turn out to be harsh. because only 3 years later, the brutal Soviet man-made famine on Ukraine would start. And as you can see on this map, it affected Gammalsvenskby as well. This obviously made the Swedes regret their decision to return, and talks about moving back again emerged. However, this time, the Soviet Union would not be so kind, with this instead resulting in a bunch of Swedes getting sent to horrible cold working camps in Siberia. And as if that hadn't been enough, then World War II struck. At first, the Germans were seen as liberators, but as it quickly turned out, life under German occupation wasn't much better. Still, an interesting fact is that the Swedes were granted German citizenship, which resulted in many also fighting for them during the war. But as the tide of the war turned, and the Soviets started reclaiming territory, the Germans began evacuating their citizens from the land, and as the Swedes from Gammalsvenskby were now also German, they were evacuated as well, with most being sent to this eastern part of Germany. From there, a few managed to escape to Sweden, but with the rest getting captured by the Red Army and subsequently sent to working camps. After the war, things changed again. The village of Gammalsvenskby, alongside the 3 surrounding German settlements, were all renamed to more Russian-sounding names, and then officially merged into one larger town, which just took on the name Zmejevka. But after this, nothing interesting really happens. It's just standard Soviet history, so let's fast forward to the fall of the Union. Now a new chapter for Gammalsvenskby, or Zmejevka, could unfold. For the first time in decades, contact with Sweden was finally re-established, and the state Sweden found the village in was somewhat surprising. They discovered that there were still around 200 people that had Swedish ancestry, though only a few still spoke Swedish fluently. The village also adopted a new emblem that shows off their mixed Swedish-Ukrainian heritage. However, slowly but surely, the Swedish cultural heritage was dying. By 2016, the village had half their population that still had Swedish heritage. And yet, even in this state, there were plans to keep the village history alive, as in 2022, they were preparing to open a museum dedicated to the Swedish villagers who founded the town. But tragically, the opening of the museum never happened. Instead, the full-scale Russian invasion happened. After initially failing to seize Kiev, the Russians instead redirected their efforts south, where they eventually captured Gammalsvenskby in April of 2022. However, 6 months later, during the Ukrainian Kherson counteroffensive, the town was liberated as the Russians retreated to the east of the Dnieper River to stabilize the front lines. But sadly, the end of the occupation did not mean the end of the suffering, since the Russian forces have continuously bombed the town, despite it having no military significance. By 2024, only about 70 people remained in the town, with around 90% of the entire settlement being completely destroyed. And while this seems like a very sad ending to the story, there is some hope, since the Swedish government has promised to help rebuild the town to its pre-war state after the war is over. All we can do is hope it follows through.